Before we walk into this story together, I want to be really honest with you about what we're going to talk about. This is a home invasion case involving a family of 4 in a quiet, suburban Connecticut town. We're going to talk about extreme violence, sexual assault, the murders of a mother and 2 daughters, and a father who survives with profound physical and emotional scars. I'm not going to linger on gore or give graphic blow-by-blow descriptions. That's not what this channel is about. But even without that, this is one of the most harrowing crimes you'll ever hear. If you have a history of trauma, especially around home break-ins, sexual violence, or family loss, please check in with yourself right now. If you feel your chest tighten just hearing this intro, it is completely okay to click away. Your well-being is more important than any video. If you stay, we're going to focus on 3 things. How a normal Sunday in a safe neighborhood turned into a 7-hour nightmare. How the investigation and trials raised huge questions about policing, punishment, and the death penalty. And how one man, left alive when his family wasn't, has tried to build something out of the ashes of what happened. This is the story of the Cheshire Home Invasion. And it starts in a place that, on paper, should have been one of the safest corners of America. Cheshire, Connecticut. If you've never been to that part of New England, picture winding roads, big trees, well-kept lawns, and comfortable homes. Cheshire sits in New Haven County, close enough to urban centers that people commute in, far enough away that it feels like classic suburbia. It's the kind of town people move to for the schools, for the quiet, for the sense that things like that don't happen here. The Petit family fit right into that picture. William Petit, Bill, was a physician and endocrinologist. Patients remember him as gentle, nerdy in a kind of endearing way, and deeply committed to his work. His wife, Jennifer Hawke-Petit, had been a nurse and a teacher. She lived with multiple sclerosis and spent a lot of her time raising awareness and funds for MS research. They had 2 daughters. 17-year-old Haley was the classic overachiever, in the best sense. Smart, athletic, kind. She had just graduated from high school and was getting ready to go to Dartmouth College. She ran track, played sports, and raised money for MS in honor of her mom. 11-year-old Michaela, the younger sister, loved cooking. That might seem like a small detail, but it's one that sticks for a lot of people who learn about this case. This little girl put together meals for her family, planned menus, liked to take care of people in that way. By July 2007, the Petit were doing what so many American families do in summer, living their lives in a rhythm of errands, small celebrations, and everyday routines. On Sunday, July 22nd, they had one of those days. That afternoon, Jennifer and Michaela went to the Stop and Shop grocery store in town. Michaela was going to cook dinner for the family, pasta, maybe, or some comfort food she'd picked out. They parked their car, walked in together, and moved around the aisles like 100 other mothers and daughters that day. They had no idea someone was watching them. In that same parking lot was a 26-year-old man named Joshua Komisarjevsky. He was there on completely unrelated business, picking up a check for some contracting work. But while he waited, he noticed Jennifer and Michaela. He noticed the car they were driving, the way they looked, the vague markers of comfortable that some people use to spot potential targets. He followed them with his eyes. And then, when they finished their shopping and drove away, he followed them in his car. He trailed their vehicle back through Cheshire's leafy roads, watching as they turned into their driveway and disappeared into the 2-story house the family had worked so hard for. He took note of the neighborhood, the style of the home, the sense that this was a place where people probably kept money, maybe jewelry, maybe things worth stealing. Then he drove away, back to his own life, back to his own young daughter, and tucked her into bed that night. But the house in Cheshire was still in his head. Later that evening, he connected with his friend and sometime accomplice, a 44-year-old man named Steven Hayes. At the time, Hayes was a career criminal with a long record of nonviolent offenses, burglaries, drugs, that kind of thing. Years later, in prison, Hayes would come out as a trans woman and begin using a different name, but in 2007, he presented as male and the world knew him as Steven Hayes. Komisarjevsky told him about the house he'd just scouted. For them, this started as just another burglary. The plan, as they would later tell it, was simple. Go into the Petit home in the middle of the night, tie everyone up, take what they wanted, and leave. No witnesses harmed. No bodies. Of course, criminals often tell themselves that. It makes it easier to cross that line into someone else's life. As the evening turned into night, text messages flew back and forth between the 2 men, joking, edgy, restless. Hayes talked about chomping at the bit to get started. Komisarjevsky said he was putting the kid to bed. Hayes replied that the horses want to get loose. You can feel the anticipation in those messages. Two men, one younger and restless, one older and desperate, psyching each other up. Sometime after midnight, in the early hours of Monday, July 23, 2007, they got into a car with a baseball bat, rope, and zip ties, and drove back to that quiet Cheshire street. Inside the Petit house, things were peaceful. Dr. Petit fell asleep on a sofa in the sunroom at the back of the house, a place where the summer air could drift in through the screens. Jennifer and the girls were upstairs in their bedrooms, winding down after the weekend. Maybe they were thinking about Monday plans, work, camp, errands, or maybe they were just tired, the way you are at the end of a long summer day. They had no reason to imagine that anyone even knew who they were, much less that someone was on the way. Outside, the two men parked and moved quietly toward the house. Komisarjevsky slipped around to the back and found an unlocked basement door. One of those little vulnerabilities we all have in our homes, the thing you mean to lock but forget, especially in a safe town. He went down the steps, saw a baseball bat leaning against the wall, and picked it up. Then he moved up into the house. In the dim light of the early morning, he saw Dr. Petit asleep on the couch. He walked over and brought the bat down on his head. In their later statements, they'd estimate 4 or 5 blows. It's hard to fully imagine the violence of that moment. 1 second, you're asleep, maybe halfway through a dream. The next, your skull is cracking under a blunt instrument, your world exploding into pain and confusion. Dr. Petit was badly injured, but he survived those blows. Disoriented and bleeding, he tried to make sense of what was happening as the two intruders tied his wrists and ankles with rope and zip ties. One of them said something like, "If he moves, put 2 bullets in him." There was a gun or talk of a gun. Threats. Warnings. Upstairs, Jennifer and the girls were jolted awake and confronted. Each of them was tied to her own bed, wrists and ankles bound, pillowcases or cloth placed over their heads. They could hear movement in the house, voices. The low murmur of 2 men who had decided their family was now an obstacle to get past. The intruders searched the house for cash and valuables and came up disappointingly short. This isn't a movie. Most middle-class families don't have stacks of money lying around. They did, however, find the Petit checkbook and bank records. They learned that the family had access to a line of credit with tens of thousands of dollars available. They decided they wanted $15,000 of it. At some point in those early hours, they moved Dr. Petit from the sunroom to the basement, tying him to a support pole. He was conscious, drifting in and out, able to hear some of what was happening above him, powerless to stop it. Time moved in that strange way it does during a crisis, both incredibly slow and shockingly fast. Outside, the sky lightened. Morning in Cheshire, Connecticut, began like any other, dog walkers, commuters, kids sleeping in. People drove past the Petit house, having no idea of the horror playing out inside. Around dawn, Hayes left the house briefly to buy gasoline, caught later on a gas station surveillance camera, filling red cans that would become horribly important later. Then he returned to the neighborhood, parking again without drawing attention. Inside, the men decided it was time to get the money. They untied Jennifer, or partially freed her, and threatened her. If she didn't cooperate, if she alerted anyone, the girls would die. They drove her in the family car to a Bank of America branch in town, arriving right around opening time. I want you to picture this from Jennifer's perspective for a second. You've just spent hours tied up, listening to your husband being beaten and your daughters threatened. You're taken from your home, driven to a bank in broad daylight. You are terrified that any wrong move will get your children killed. You walk into the bank with one of the men hovering nearby, and you need to somehow both get the money and get help. Jennifer approached the teller and asked to withdraw $15,000 from their line of credit. It was more than most people pull out in cash on a random Monday morning. She seemed anxious, shaken. At some point, according to later testimony, she found a way to tell the bank staff that her family was being held hostage and that the men had threatened to kill them if she didn't return with the money. The bank manager did something absolutely critical. They believed her. While honoring the withdrawal, they discreetly contacted the police. The manager stayed on the phone with 911, giving real-time updates as Jennifer left with the cash, got back into the car, and drove away with Hayes at the wheel. This is the point in the story where most of us, watching from a safe distance, instinctively think, okay, now the cavalry is coming. Now they're going to stop this. And police did respond. Officers headed toward the neighborhood. They knew they were dealing with a reported home invasion and hostages. They also knew that a potentially armed suspect had just left a bank with a victim who seemed convinced that her family would die if anything went wrong. By the time Hayes and Jennifer returned to the Petit house, there were officers in the area. They did not rush the door. Instead, following the training and protocols they had at the time, they set up a perimeter. They staged quietly, trying not to spook the suspects into immediate violence. They called for backup and special units. They began to plan. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. No screams from windows. No gunshots. No flames yet. Inside, things were escalating in ways the officers couldn't see. While Jennifer was at the bank, left alone in the house with the girls, Komisarjevsky sexually assaulted 11-year-old Michaela. He later admitted this, and there was physical evidence to back it up. He even took photos on his phone, evidence of both his depravity and the fact that he had time and a sense of safety to commit that assault. When Hayes and Jennifer came back from the bank, Hayes raped Jennifer downstairs. Upstairs, Haley and Michaela were still tied to their beds, listening to pieces of what was happening, terrified. At some point after Jennifer's return, Dr. Petit, in the basement, managed to loosen his bindings. Beaten, bleeding, dizzy from blood loss, he realized that whatever was happening upstairs was reaching a tipping point. He later said that in that moment, he thought to himself, "It's now or never." He somehow got free of the ropes and zip ties, crawled across the basement, and made his way up into the yard. He staggered, half crawling, half running, across the lawn to a neighbor's house, battered so badly that the neighbor at first didn't even recognize him. The neighbor called 911. Almost simultaneously, inside the Petit home, things snapped. In his later confession, Hayes said that after Dr. Petit escaped, and after Hayes and Komisarjevsky realized the police were outside, Hayes strangled Jennifer. They then doused parts of the house with gasoline. The first floor, the stairs, the girls' rooms, even the girls themselves. They poured accelerant on the beds where Haley and Michaela were still tied. And then they lit the match. Flames erupted, feeding on the gasoline, the furniture, the dry wood of a New England house built to be cozy, not to stand up to arson. Smoke billowed. The heat climbed fast. Haley somehow managed to get free enough to move. Evidence later suggested that she got out of her bed and tried to run. She made it into the hallway near the top of the staircase before collapsing, overcome by heat and smoke. Michaela died still tied to her bed. Both girls' official cause of death was smoke inhalation. Outside, officers saw smoke and then fire. At almost the same moment, they saw the Petit family SUV back out of the driveway at speed. Hayes and Komisarjevsky were trying to flee. Police moved in. They followed the SUV. It didn't get far. Just a short distance from the burning house, the car crashed into a police vehicle that had blocked the road. Officers swarmed. The two men were pulled from the vehicle and arrested on the spot. Behind them, the Petit home was engulfed. Firefighters rushed in as soon as it was deemed safe enough. They found Jennifer's body on the first floor. They found Haley and Michaela upstairs. Dr. Petit, sitting in a neighbor's yard, watched his house burn, watched emergency crews surge toward it, and had to process in real time the fact that his wife and daughters were almost certainly still inside. There are some things the human mind isn't built to hold. This is one of them. News of what had happened spread quickly, first in Cheshire, then across Connecticut, then nationwide. It was, in every sense, a suburban nightmare. A respected doctor, a beloved nurse and mother, two bright, promising daughters, a good neighborhood, a random grocery store trip, two men with a plan to rob a house. For a lot of people, this case shattered something fundamental, the belief that locking your doors and living in a good town is enough. In the days and weeks that followed, details began to trickle out. The text messages between Hayes and Komisarjevsky, Komisarjevsky's history of burglaries, and the fact that he'd been paroled not long before the attack. The bank teller's 911 call. The fact that police had been outside the house for roughly half an hour before the fire started, watching and waiting. That last piece became a major point of controversy. Some people looked at the timeline and asked an anguished question. If officers had gone in earlier, if they'd stormed the house right after the bank call, could they have saved Jennifer and the girls? Cheshire police and other law enforcement officials defended their response. They pointed out that rushing a house with armed, unpredictable suspects and hostages inside can, in some cases, trigger exactly the kind of fatal violence you're trying to prevent. Hostage situations are some of the hardest calls police ever handle. There's rarely a perfect option. Still, for many in the public, and for some of the Petit family's friends, that half hour became a wound. It raised painful questions about how we balance caution and urgency, and about how our brains, after the fact, always want to rewind and fix things we can't actually fix. In the background, two criminal cases began to gather momentum. Hayes and Komisarjevsky were each charged with a long list of crimes, multiple counts of capital murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, burglary, arson, and more. Connecticut still had the death penalty on the books in 2007, and prosecutors made it clear from the start that they would seek it. The cases were separated. Hayes would be tried first, then Komisarjevsky. For the Petit family, that meant not one trial, but two. Hayes's trial began in September 2010, 3 years after the murders. In the guilt phase, the jury heard about the home invasion, the beatings, the assaults, the arson. They heard Dr. Petit testify, describing waking up on the couch, the blows from the bat, drifting in and out of awareness in the basement, hearing muffled sounds from above, making the decision to escape. They saw crime scene photos, not the ones the media tends to publish, but the raw, unedited images that jurors have to live with for the rest of their lives. The defense didn't really argue that Hayes wasn't there. Instead, they tried to shift as much blame as possible onto Komisarjevsky, painting him as the mastermind. Their argument was less he didn't do it, and more he followed, he panicked, he snapped. The jury wasn't persuaded. They found Hayes guilty on 16 of 17 counts. Then came the penalty phase, where the same jury had to decide whether he should be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, or to death. This is where all the big moral questions that float around in society crash into one specific set of people in one specific courtroom. On one side, the prosecution argued that the aggravating factors, the cruelty, the death of a child, the torture, the arson, made this exactly the sort of case the death penalty was designed for. If not for this, they implied, then for what? On the other side, the defense talked about Hayes's messed up life, his mental health issues, his remorse. They argued that spending the rest of his life in a small cell, with nothing but time and guilt, was punishment enough. Dr. Petit sat in that courtroom listening. Later, he would call this crime his own personal holocaust. After deliberating, the jury recommended death. The judge imposed 6 death sentences, 1 for each capital count, plus more than a century of additional time for the other crimes. It was almost symbolic, stacking a punishment on top of a punishment, as if sheer quantity could match the magnitude of what happened in that house. A little over a year later, in 2011, it was Komisarjevsky's turn. His trial followed a similar structure, guilt phase, then penalty. Jurors heard about his long history with crime, the home invasions he'd committed as a teenager, the way he'd sometimes stand over sleeping homeowners and listen to them breathe before leaving without waking them. They heard about his troubled childhood, allegations of abuse, the psychiatric reports. They also heard, in his own words, how he followed Jennifer and Michaela home from the grocery store, how he broke into the Petit house, how he sexually assaulted Michaela, how he took photos during the assault. And they read from his jailhouse journals, where he tried to cast himself as less responsible, at times suggesting that Dr. Petit could have done more to save his family. That, for a lot of people, crossed from delusion into cruelty. The jury found him guilty on all 17 counts. In the penalty phase, they recommended death. The judge sentenced him accordingly. By early 2012, both men were on Connecticut's death row. For Dr. Petit, that brought a measure of something like peace. He has spoken about feeling not joy, but a kind of grim relief that the state had acknowledged the enormity of the crime with its harshest punishment. But beyond that individual case, the Cheshire murders were doing something else. They were reshaping the death penalty debate in Connecticut. Even before 2007, there were lawmakers and activists pushing to abolish capital punishment in the state. Connecticut hadn't executed many people in the modern era, only one since the 1970s. The system was expensive, slow, and critics argued inherently flawed. Then this case happened. For those who supported the death penalty, the Cheshire Home Invasion became Exhibit A, proof that there are crimes so monstrous that society has a moral right, or even a duty, to execute the perpetrator. Any move to abolish the death penalty, they said, should not apply to men like Hayes and Komisarjevsky. For those who opposed it, the case was a test of principles. If you truly believed the state shouldn't kill, you had to be willing to hold that line not just for the borderline cases, but for the worst of the worst. The debate went on for years. In 2012, Connecticut's legislature finally passed a bill repealing the death penalty for future cases. The governor signed it. On paper, capital punishment was gone going forward. But there was a compromise built into that law. It left the existing death sentences in place. Men already on death row, including Hayes and Komisarjevsky, were still technically facing execution. That half measure didn't survive. In 2015, the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that executing people after the legislature had declared the death penalty no longer acceptable for future crimes was unconstitutional. You couldn't, they said, have a system where two men who committed similar murders on different days received fundamentally different ultimate punishments just because of timing. So the court commuted all remaining death sentences to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Hayes and Komisarjevsky would never face lethal injection. Instead, they would spend the rest of their lives in prison, ultimately moved out of Connecticut to high-security facilities in Pennsylvania, part of an agreement between states to house certain inmates. For Dr. Petit and many others, that ruling was a deep blow. He had sat through 2 trials, 2 penalty phases, hours upon hours of gut-wrenching testimony, under the understanding that the outcome would be death sentences. Undoing those sentences years later felt, to him, like a betrayal, not just of his family, but of the jurors who had made that decision, and of the broader promise that some lines still meant something. For others in Connecticut, including families affected by a different notorious murder case, the ruling was a relief. They felt the death penalty was a false promise, a punishment that sounded decisive but rarely got carried out. They believed life without parole was enough, and that taking execution off the table removed one more layer of legal appeals that kept cases in limbo. Where you land on that may depend on your own experiences, your values, your beliefs about what justice is supposed to feel like. What's clear is that the Cheshire case sat at the center of that debate like an exposed nerve. Meanwhile, life somehow went on. The Petit house, burned and gutted, stood for a while as a blackened reminder at the end of the street. Eventually, it was torn down. The lot where it once stood became the site of a small memorial garden, flowers, benches, a place to remember without having to stare at the shell of the place where everything happened. Dr. Petit had to figure out what it meant to be the sole survivor of something like this. Physically, he recovered from his injuries. The human body is stubborn that way. Emotionally, it's more complicated. He has talked about the difficulty of sleeping, of trusting, of being in crowds, of survivor's guilt, why him and not them, of the surreal experience of being both a victim and a public figure, asked to relive the worst day of his life over and over again in interviews and courtrooms. But he also made some deliberate choices. He founded the Petit Family Foundation, a charity focused on causes that reflected the passions of Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela, supporting education, especially for women in science, helping people living with chronic illnesses like MS, and supporting efforts to stop violence against women. He turned his family's name into something associated not just with horror, but with scholarships, research grants, and programs that make other people's lives better. He eventually remarried to a woman who had volunteered with the foundation. They have children together. The fact that he has a new family doesn't cancel out the old one. Love isn't arithmetic like that. It just means that his story has more chapters than the one written in July 2007. For some people, seeing him remarry and have more kids was bittersweet, a reminder that life does go on, even after unimaginable loss. For others, it was an example of something we all like to believe in, resilience. If you watch or read a lot of true crime, it's easy to slip into a certain mindset. We start ranking cases in our heads. Which one is the most brutal, the most senseless, the most haunting? We focus on killers, on motives, on courtroom drama. We argue online about whether sentences were enough. But underneath all of that are quieter questions. What does safety actually mean? If a man can follow you home from the grocery store and turn your house into a crime scene, how should police handle situations where any move could make things worse? Are we willing to accept that sometimes, even with a perfect response, people are going to die? What do we really want from punishment? Revenge, deterrence, containment, some combination of all three? And how do we carry forward the memory of victims in a way that honors their lives, not just their deaths? In the Cheshire case, there's another psychological thread that's worth sitting with. The way our brains cling to if only. If only the basement door had been locked. If only someone had noticed the men lurking in the neighborhood. If only Komisarjevsky hadn't gone to that particular stop and shop. If only the bank had called sooner, or the police had gone in faster, or Dr. Petit had escaped a few minutes earlier. If only is the mind's way of trying to wrestle chaos into something that feels manageable. If we can identify the one decision that caused everything, we can tell ourselves that we would have made a different one. The harder truth is that terrible events like this are usually the result of many small decisions by many people, combined with sheer bad luck. The Petit did ordinary, reasonable things, left a basement door unlocked in a safe town, went to the store at dusk, trusted that their home was a sanctuary. The bank manager did the right thing and called 911. The police followed protocols that made sense in many other hostage situations. Two men made a series of cruel, selfish, and sadistic choices. When we ask who failed the Petit family, the most honest answer starts with them. Hayes and Komisarjevsky failed them utterly. The system that allowed a man with Komisarjevsky's history to be paroled so quickly may have failed them too. The political focus on nonviolent offenders and prison overcrowding meant that someone with clear risk factors was back on the street in a position to do harm. Whether the police failed them is a question reasonable people disagree on. Some see that half hour as unforgivable. Others see it as a tragic example of how imperfect human beings make the best decisions they can with the information they have. What there's no disagreement on is this: 3 lives that should have stretched on for decades ended in a house that became a furnace. So as we close this story, I want to shift the spotlight one more time away from the men whose names show up in court records and back to the people whose names are on a gravestone. Jennifer Hawke-Petit. She was a nurse, a mom, a wife, a woman living with a chronic illness who still poured herself into her family and community. She loved her daughters fiercely. She worked to raise money for MS research, turning her own diagnosis into motivation to help others. Haley Petit, 17, a recent high school graduate heading to Dartmouth. A runner, a student, a big sister. She raised money through Haley's Hope and walked for a cure for MS with her mom. She should have spent the next decades figuring out who she wanted to be. Michaela Petit, 11, a kid who loved to cook dinner for her family. The kind of child who might have grown up to be a chef or a scientist or something else entirely. On that last night, she went to the store with her mom to buy food for a meal she was excited to make. They were not statistics. They were not just victims in the Cheshire Home Invasion. They were 3 whole human beings whose lives intersected with 2 men on one terrible night. Wherever you are right now, on a commute, cleaning your kitchen, lying in bed with headphones in, I'd ask you to take a quiet moment and say their names in your mind. Jennifer, Haley, Michaela. We can't go back to that basement door and lock it. We can't sit in that stop-and-shop parking lot and tell Jennifer to drive to a different store. We can't stand on Susquehanna Avenue at 9:30 a.m. and walk up to that house before the match is lit. What we can do is remember them, support the kind of work that tries to prevent violence like this, and be a little more willing to look out for our neighbors, to speak up when something feels off, to push our systems, courts, parole boards, police departments, to learn from their worst failures. Because in the end, the story of the Cheshire Home Invasion is not just about how fragile safety can be. It's about what we choose to do with that knowledge once we have it.